Hello everyone, this is Bbeltdan, and I'm going to be building a replica of the demon blade from Supernatural. Alright everyone, so to get started I have my reference image here and I have a sheet of aluminum. I'm using aluminum because with this being a prop or a replica prop blade and it's not supposed to be meant to be functional in any particular way or form, aluminum will work out just fine. It is easy to cut, it is easy to work, and it already comes pretty well polished and gives a nice shine with minimal amount of buffing or polishing to look exactly like what we see on the actual show. So here I'm working through it and I'm putting in my dimensions, guesstimating about how big the knife is by using my hand as a reference with the hand that's in the image and trying to scale it up, and I think I got it pretty close but not exact because I had to do some changes later on, which you'll see, to try to get everything to fit on that knife. It could have been a little bit longer, but oh well, it's the way it goes. So I'm drawing in the basic design, so when I take it over to my bandsaw I know what all I need to remove and what all I can keep. Now I take it over to my bandsaw where I went ahead and swapped out the blade with a metal cutting blade. You could use a standard wood blade on aluminum, but I would really recommend that you get one with as many teeth per inch as possible and take your time. Go very slow and use lots of lubricant so it goes ahead and doesn't destroy the blade. But because I had the metal cutting blade, it made everything just a lot easier. It just slices through it relatively quickly. There was some jagged edging, but I think that's because I have a slight kink inside that blade that causes it to kind of jag or move a little bit too much while cutting. Now I take it over to the vise, clamp it down, and start going through with different files to try to get as much of this down. Now with aluminum, with it being as soft as it is, you can use even the rough type of real raspy files to go ahead and remove a lot of material, and then use your fine little tooth files to try to get those small details. With that bandsaw I wasn't able to really get into these small little areas here, as you can see with these serrations, so just taking my time, filing it down and working on it. And I wanted to try to get as much of this done as possible with all the fine details here, because it would be less that I have to do once I take this over to my belt sander. And with this being aluminum, you can work on it real quick. I think from start to finish, from when I started drawing it until when I was done with the sanding portion of it, not necessarily the finishing or the polishing, I had the whole blade done within 1 hour. Now I'm using my trusty belt sander to go ahead and remove even more material and to go ahead and put on those finish cuts to narrow down the profile and give it its edge. So, and with this particular belt sander, I'm actually using for the first time a ceramic belt on it, which I highly recommend because they not only they do a good job removing a lot of material, but they also last far longer than they do on the standard belts. They're worth a little bit more. The price of one belt, it tends to be about the cost of maybe 3 or 4 of the standard belts, but because of how long it lasts and how well it lasts, I highly recommended ceramic over standard belts. Now also when you're working with metal, I'd recommend that you probably keep like a pot of water close by to dip your metal in, because it's going to get hot real quick under the belt sander to the point to where you can't even really handle it. So if you can dip it in the water every now and then, you can get back to work on it real quick. Now here I am trying for the very first time a process to etch in details into the blade. There were a lot of little details that would take me forever to try to carve it out or to work it with the Dremel, so I decided to go ahead and try this electric etching, which is very simple. You just have a bucket of water, highly salted, so put a lot of salt into it. As you can see, I used iodized salt, worked very well, well diluted, and went ahead and on the blade I masked off areas that I did not want to have removed through this process, and I went ahead and strapped a wire onto it, which will be connected to a positive side of this battery charger that I have laying around, and on the negative side I just have this little sacrificial washer, which it's sacrificial, and I don't think anything really happened to it except it got a small little bit of aluminum coating. So once again on this process, just take a vat of water, put a bunch of salt into it to the point to where it won't dilute the salt any further, and just connect positive to one side, negative to the other side, and I have electrical tape to mask off the areas that I want to leave untouched. And here you can see it working. When you got the bubbling, that means it is working. And I do believe you have to make sure you have the positive on what you're wanting to remove and the negative on the other thing. And here it is. I'm going to start removing the electrical tape, and it did a decent job. It removed just enough material on both sides where there was a pretty good indentation. So with my first time, I was thoroughly impressed that this was able to work. Now for the lettering that is on it, I could have done the exact same process, but I figured because they were so small, I could go ahead and just use my Dremel with a diamond cutting bit or engraving bit on it to get those words marked out just as easy and just as quick, which worked out very well. And just to note, for those of y'all that are big fans of it, I don't have all the lettering on it because at this point in time I realize that the blade is a bit too small, but I get it to work. So now here I went ahead and gone to my disc grinder and replaced one of them with a buffing wheel so I can go ahead and work on buffing the blade to a nice polished shine to match what we see on screen. Now, besides me showing you my stylish socks, this right here shows you the completed handle, also with this little guard piece that I fabricated off screen using a forging process. I did not record that because I had some trouble, and this is going to be a piece of wood that's making up the bulk of the handle, but I'm going to be sculpting it out of other material later to get that bone look. Now back to the belt sander with that same ceramic belt. I am now kind of rounding off the edges for the handle. I'm not doing any kind of real major sculpting on this handle because I'm going to be doing that later using the trusty epoxy clay, try to get those details down. Now if I don't have epoxy clay, I could just sculpt this wood, carve this wood into the design, and it would actually come pretty close to looking just like that antler horn or that bone that the blade is, or the handle of this blade is normally made out of. But because I had the epoxy clay, I decided to go ahead and sculpt that. But so I'm not using all my epoxy clay. This wood is just to kind of help beef up the handle so I don't have to use as much. And now using that trusty epoxy clay, it's a part A, part B mix where you use equal parts and mix it together, and it forms a clay which hardens within a couple of hours. But until then, you actually have quite a bit of working time on it. I've used it for puppets, I've used it for other props and stuff that I made, so it's great stuff. So just take two parts, equal, A and B, mix it up thoroughly, and start to apply it on there. And once I get it applied to where I have the bulk of the blade, I go back in a little bit later and sculpt in the fine details, and I find that using just plain water is very effective in smoothing out this epoxy clay to try to give a nice finished look. But even if you want even more refined finished look, you can go back in once it's done drying and carve out more details, or give it a nice sanding, which is what I go ahead and do using some 400 grit sandpaper to kind of really smooth it out. But it really works out very well, and in the end I'm actually happy with the results that I got off of this. So making sure that it fits in my hand, and now I'm using the cheapo little pencil that I found laying around to kind of put in some subtle marks that for texture of to try to get that antler look on it, because I think that's what that handle is made out of, is more of the antler horn. Now I'm going through and giving it a fine little off-white paint job. This is after it has been sanded, and I go through a layer of this and a layer of a light brown, and then subtly through darker layers until I get the look that I want. And with it being an antler horn, if you look at it, it looks like that it was shaped or carved towards the two ends, exposing more of that bone and exposing less of the outer husk of the antler horn. But at this point in time, I'm almost completely done with the blade. And this blade ultimately was a Christmas present for a friend of the family who is a big fan of Supernatural, more particularly Crowley, so I thought that this would be fitting for them, fans of the demon side of the characters on Supernatural. And I did do a angel blade, which I may or may not do a video for that a little bit later. Now at this point in time, just putting in some 2-part epoxy resin inside it to go ahead and assemble it all together. And I'm using this 2-part epoxy resin because, once again, with this being just a prop replica, it doesn't have to be functional, so it doesn't have to have a lot of strength. It just needs to hold itself together, doing its job, just sitting on a desk somewhere, or for the occasional cosplay if the owner of the new blade decides that they want to use it a part of their cosplaying costumes. And here we go, it's the finished blade, and it turned out very well. Let me know what y'all probably think. So, I mean, it looks very passable, and people will recognize it for that blade. So, once again, this is the Demon Blade from Supernatural, and this is Bbeltdan, and I want to say thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.